There's been a lot of news coming out of Moscow about murders. Something's going on. But the real story is not about the murders. It's about the consolidation which those murders indicate. Because right now, under pressure at home and failing abroad, Putin is reflexively building a shadow fortress. He's building an autocratic state within the Russian state. And that's why when we see a seizure of media, a purge of the generals, the secret jails being built, or somebody else going through a window, it's the signs that the regime is trying to survive. It doesn't know what else to do. And today we're going to dig into that. We're going to examine exactly what this fortress is about, and we're going to unravel it from within. So, just over the past couple of weeks, saw a lot of news, such as Andrei Badalov, who is the vice president of Transneft. Now, he fell out of a window at his luxury apartment. Of course, it was ruled that that was a suicide, but there's something interesting about him. So, he was in charge of critical infrastructure for an oil company. And what he had information about, it appears, was about pipeline fraud and also sanction leaks. These are things that made him a dangerous person, and he's no longer here. We had Konstantin Strukov, who is the head of the third largest gold producer in Russia. Sure enough, the FSB arrested him on his airplane as he's about to fly to Turkey. Now they're seeking a 100% nationalization of his company. That billionaire had spent years supporting Putin's party, but this obviously sends a chilling effect to the other oligarchs of what happens if you get on the wrong side of the government. We also saw the Minister of Transport. Same thing happened with him. He, in fact, killed himself after it was announced that he was going to be fired. He might have killed himself actually before he knew he was about to be fired, but that's neither here nor there. His thing was that he was involved in embezzling money from the government meant for national defense in Kursk, Russia, where the Ukrainians eventually broke through and occupied the region. Now, even if we're trying to be charitable about this, we don't want to say it's a purge. We have to come to the conclusion that it's certainly not good for Putin what's going on. So, Mark Galeotti writes in The Spectator that what we are seeing is, quote, more like the convulsions of a system in slow motion crisis, a business elite increasingly engaged in cannibalistic competition for diminishing assets, a Kremlin that mistrusts the people on whom it depends to run its country and economy, that demands compliance with unspoken, unfixed, and unclear rules. It certainly doesn't mean Putinism is headed for some imminent fall, but it does demonstrate that even as the war machine continues to grind on, the damage being done to the Russian regime is very real. And that regime is very damaged. It has a lot of internal problems. And today, when we go through this, I think you'll see for yourself that Putin has got his hands full. Putin has so many problems that even his problems have problems. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I've studied Russia for more than 20 years. And I've been working against the Putin regime for that entire time, which is why I got kicked out of Russia when I was still only 24 years old for being a threat to Russian national security. So today, Putin is in a fight for his own survival. And what we see happening there is that people are doing everything they can to get ahead, knowing that there's limited resources and limited time as things could change at any moment. So please help me get out this message of what's really happening inside of Russia to more people. This is something that we're doing to help support Ukraine because the more people understand the truth about the Putin regime, the mafia that it is, the more clear it becomes as to why Ukraine must win. It's something that helps not just Ukraine, but everybody globally will benefit to see the downfall of the Putin regime. And just one last note, thank you to everybody who has donated to help the Ukrainian soldiers get more drones. We've raised now more than 25,000 euros, and that will save Ukrainian soldiers and civilians' lives. And we're going to continue fundraising. I'll put a link in the first comment below, the pinned comment. The drones that we've raised so far have gone to help the 225, which is located in Sumy, Ukraine. That's exactly where the Russians are trying to break through. We're also helping a unit in Pokrovsk, which is the other part that's under heavy fighting right now as the Russians try to break through. So the units have sent their thanks, and they will continue to send their thanks, I'm sure, because we are really contributing to something great. We're doing something that really helps save lives. So please contribute if you could. Thank you. So let's look at the situation economically in Russia first as a background as to why there's more pressure now than ever before. So we know that the Russian National Wealth Fund has dwindled from about $210 billion to $167 billion in just under 12 months. But there's something else. A lot of the money it has or the assets it has are not liquid. It only has about 50 billion and they're burning through it very fast. And there's no more money that the government can get. It's not like they can just print more money. Well, they could. But with Russia's high inflation rate currently, and that would probably be a very bad idea. Now, economists in the United States, including at Johns Hopkins, have estimated that real inflation in Russia is already about 27%. When you read Russian Telegram, people are endlessly complaining that food prices, rent prices are out of control. And the government tries to find more liquidity. But fuel revenues plunged by another 14% in June alone, another $13.6 billion under the G7 price caps. And consider this as well. Just in 2022, over $50 billion of elite assets were seized. Everything from global infrastructure to yachts. And what that means is that the elites are already in a tight spot because of that. With frozen reserves and limited export access, Russia is approaching a ruble debt crisis. And that, in fact, might become a default risk by as soon as 2026 because the bonds are maturing. So we have a regime now that has always survived on plunder, of just stealing everything from the Russian state. It never created revenue, it never created growth, just theft. And now today there's a fight for scarcity. Everyone was always used to getting rich at the expense of the state. But now there's simply less state assets. There's less ability to embezzle money. And those closest to Putin, which is the intelligence service of Russia, the FSB, will take part of the military's assets and now take part of the oligarchs' assets as they seek to consolidate the assets for Putin and themselves, seeing as there's not enough to go around anymore. So, what we see the Russians doing and the Russian intelligence service doing is essentially acting as consolidators of the limited money there is to make sure that those closest to Putin get to keep it. And anyone who is thought to be unloyal or anybody who might have too much assets is being liquidated or is being sent to prison or investigated or just disappears. And that's why it's probably not surprising that on July 8th, the Duma authorized the FSB to have its own jails. These are jails that are going to operate outside of civilian justice, and they're going to be built fast. By 2026, the beginning of the year, they should already be operating. And it's interesting how the FSB does this typically. So, what do they do is seize companies when they take somebody's assets? Is that they auction them off via opaque federalized sales, they call them, which are just FSB linked shell companies returning value to intelligence linked cronies. So a company is sold off. It looks like it's public, but in fact, what it really is just a shell company owned by other people in the FSB who then buy it, making sure that they get those assets. So, for instance, the oligarch who was just stopped on his airplane with 100% of his assets about to be taken from him, what's realistically going to happen is that there will be a bid for it. There's only be one company that's going to be able to win it. It's going to be some sort of a shell company, which is owned by the FSB, and thereby the FSB will get his assets. They'll take his money. So power is privatized to the secret police, and now they are profiting from it. And this is not something new. Keep in mind, Vladimir Putin has always been a mobster. Going back to St. Petersburg in the 1990s, he was tied with the major gangs back then, the Tambovs, the Milishevs, and he was involved in things like trading customs ports, trading casinos, trading within the fuel tax, all different sorts of rackets and protections that existed then, just like in any other mafia. They engaged in things as simple as smuggling cigarettes, forced labor. All these things are things that the FSB engages in, and things in which Vladimir Putin himself undoubtedly engaged in. So the Russian state, very fair to say, is just an organized crime syndicate. It lacks a fundamental ideology, despite the fact of how much people in the West talk about that, whether he's like Dugin or the Russian world, that's really for public consumption. There's very little evidence that Vladimir Putin himself believes much of it. He might feel it comforting to believe that he's doing something for Russia, but the facts speak for themselves. He's willing to go against any values if it allows him and his cronies to get more money, to get wealthier. And if you look at people around Putin, those with whom he's done business in the past, plenty of them have ended up dead. You can look at the people who worked in accounting with him, those who worked in the St. Petersburg office. There's just an endless line of dead people. And that relates back to the fact that it is literally an organized crime family. And so, though today some of the elites are losing everything due to the war, the sanctions, the frozen assets, other elites have gotten really, really rich. Consider Leonid Mikkelsen. He is at Novatech. So they arranged the pipelines and gas exports under the sanctions. They've made billions of dollars through indirect financial links. Gennady Timoshenko, his chemical companies produce the vast majority of the chemicals that are used for the weapons for the Russian military. Igor Seshin, Rosneft, they are making money off the illegal sale of oil as well. So when you think about this, 12 oligarch linked firms distribute over $11 billion in wartime dividends. 81 of them are active in arms and logistics. So overall, there are oligarchs who are gaining from this war, which is a motivation for part of the Russian elite to continue supporting the war. It has nothing to do with Russia. It has nothing to do with the well being of the Russian people. It has a lot to do with making sure the contracts keep going. And these profits are part of a pact that the Kremlin has always had. You can become incredibly wealthy, a super oligarch worth tens of billions of dollars, but you must be incredibly loyal to the Kremlin. And secondly, when Putin tells you to do something, you do it. So we all know how Prigozhin, who was in the Wagner group, ran troll centers, mercenaries, in addition to having government contracts for catering. But he's not alone. There's been a lot of that for years and years. So going back to 2021, a Time magazine article by Simon Schuster illuminates exactly how the Kremlin operates, how Putin operates, and it's truly chilling how similar it is to The Godfather. So in this interview, Schuster talks with Mikhail Friedman. He's one of the top oligarchs in Russia, incredibly wealthy. And he describes how Putin gives orders, not through formal decrees, but via implicit directives that are delivered in private meetings. These directives are never written down, they're just understood, and there's no need to speak them out loud. So he gives the example of his business partner, Pyotr Avin, who meets with Putin regularly and receives these instructions. And then he knows that without hesitation, he must act on them. There's no ambiguity. Once the message is ordered and delivered, it's expected to be followed. And this system ensures that there's a total control by the Kremlin without a paper trail. Just a nod, a phrase, a signal, and allows for Putin to enforce obedience while avoiding responsibility for any fallout that might come. So that's how the Kremlin rules: soft on the surface, but brutal in reality. And if you disobey the unspoken orders, that's not an option. They will enforce it with fear. There will be compliance with what Putin wants. So when Vladimir Putin wants something to happen, for Prigozhin's Wagner group back in the day to do something, he doesn't necessarily have to say, I want you to go to Africa and commit incredible atrocities. He just says, we're having problems in Africa. It'd be really good if somebody could go there and make sure that the mining operations we have don't have any more problems. Or he might say, this person is a real pest for me. Why does this journalist ask so many questions? Maybe you could look into that. And then a journalist ends up dead. That's how Vladimir Putin's Russia works. And that's quite similar to how the mafia operates. In fact, there's no difference. But overall, we do see cracks in the system. We see the fact that there are more leaks coming out from the FSB. Historically, that never happened, but it's happening now, which means there's already been some sort of a breakdown. And we also see that the military is going after senior Russian officials. There's been dozens of generals arrested, sidelined, and investigations launched into specifically stealing money. But why, if everybody's engaged in corruption, do they care so much? It's for a simple reason. There's limited assets, so not everybody can have them. Only those close to Putin, those closest to Putin, those on whom he counts for his security, the FSB, will get to keep those assets. So, looking at what we have today, we have a true reality that Vladimir Putin is a mobster running a mob enterprise. And a lot of what happens within the Kremlin is indicative of the regime becoming more unstable, but it's indicative of something else as well, which is that Vladimir Putin is struggling to keep the system going. He's had sort of like a Ponzi scheme for years. Everybody pays up and it gets higher and higher. But the day that the economy starts to shake and not everybody can make their contributions, not everybody can implement what he wants them to implement immediately because they lack liquidity or whatever other problems, then the Ponzi scheme starts to collapse. It depends on everybody being able to pay their share. And today, when we see starting to collapse, what that really means is the FSB, because you didn't fulfill what Putin wanted, comes to your house and rids the world of you or takes your assets from you. And in either case, it ends up worse for you and the mafia continues operating. Thank you for listening. And please like this video. Please click subscribe. As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.